Driven back by ice and exhaustion, they discover a frozen land at the edge of the world. While their bodies weaken, their maps fail, and even the ocean begins to deceive them. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. In 1772, a 17-year-old German naturalist stepped aboard His Majesty's ship Resolution. His name was Georg Forster. What followed was not only a circumnavigation of the globe, but an education in nature, humanity, and the fragile balance between curiosity and power. Through his eyes, we witness distant shores, unfamiliar cultures, and the vastness of the Pacific, not as conquerors, but as observers. This is his journey. What happened in the last episode? After departing Christmas Sound, the expedition rounded Cape Horn and entered the South Atlantic, leaving the Pacific behind. In the waters near Tierra del Fuego, whales and seals crowded the ship, while a brief encounter with Fuegians reveals a different human presence than before. On the New Year's Isles, the crew gathered supplies through relentless hunting. Pushing south again, they discovered the frozen, desolate land of South Georgia, before fog, reefs, and sudden surf nearly ended the voyage without warning. Thursday, January 26, 1775, Southern Atlantic.
With a steady breeze and weather that was, for this climate, rather clear, they continued southward. The last of the penguins they had brought from South Georgia had now been eaten, and they were once again forced to make do with their usual revolting salted rations. But the thought that they might soon reach the Cape of Good Hope made most of their discomforts easier to bear. On Friday, January 27th at noon, they found themselves at 59.5 degrees south latitude and spotted several Antarctic petrels, Procellaria glacialis, which in these high latitudes are usually harbingers of ice. Indeed, between 6 and 7 in the evening, they caught sight of various icebergs and a large amount of drift ice. Foggy, wet weather set in that day, preventing them from continuing directly south, as they had up to that point. By morning of Saturday, January 28th, they were surrounded by a vast mass of ice, and in the afternoon they encountered several solid ice fields, along with countless loose fragments. This forced them, much to the general relief, to turn back. The crew had grown thoroughly weary of the severe climate, worn down by the constant watchfulness, the exertion and the hard labor required to avoid the many dangers that arose, often without warning. They had reached only a few miles south of the 60th parallel, when they, depending on wind, fog, and ice, gradually began to steer north again. Many of the sailors had developed rheumatic pain from constant colds. Others fell into long, persistent fainting spells, hardly surprising, as their unhealthy and nutrient-poor diet could not sufficiently replenish their strength. The thermometer in that region read 35 degrees Fahrenheit, about 1.7 degrees Celsius. This cold, combined with frequent snow showers and the damp, foggy air, severely delayed the recovery of the sick. But now that they were sailing north again, they could hope for a milder climate. No one suspected that their patience was soon to be tested once more by further delays. It seemed as though they were fated to be mistaken again and again in their calculations. For now, they encountered yet another frozen land.
Tuesday, January 31st, 1775, Southern Atlantic.
The discovery was made at 7 in the morning, in such thick fog that the men could see no farther than about 9 kilometers in any direction. They sailed toward it for about an hour, until they were only around 1 kilometer from the cliffs. These cliffs were black, full of caves, steep, and astonishingly high. Countless cormorants were nesting on the upper parts, while the rocks below were pounded by roaring waves. Thick clouds covered the higher mountains, with only a single massive, heavily snow-covered peak rising far above the cloud layer. Judging by eye, everyone on board believed it had to be at least 3.7 kilometers of vertical height. Close to shore, the sounding showed a depth of 310 meters. They then steered the ship southward, intending to sail around the western tip of the newly discovered land. After barely an hour on this course, they spotted a high mountain range about 9 kilometers to the south-southeast, which they must have passed close by during the previous night. Since this was the southernmost end of the land, Georg's father named it Southern Thule, and Captain Cook kept that name.
The term Thule comes from antiquity. As early as Greek and Roman times, geographers described a mythical island far to the north of Europe, which they called Ultima Thule, the farthest Thule, meaning the last known land at the edge of the world. It was believed to be a place of eternal fog, cold and darkness. Thule thus became a symbol of the end of the known world. The region where the Resolution was now sailing was just as cold, storm-lashed, and surrounded by ice and fog. The newly discovered, rugged island group at the edge of the Antarctic Sea strongly reminded the sailors of those ancient ideas of Thule. That is why they named the island group Southern Thule. Although it was not in the north but in the south, the feeling was the same. They had reached the farthest edge of the world. Far from any civilization, in a hostile and desolate environment. The naming of Southern Thule therefore shows how strongly the explorers were still guided by ancient geographical concepts, and how powerfully the nature of this remote region revived the image of Thule.
It lay below 59 degrees, 30 minutes south latitude, and 27 degrees 30 minutes west longitude. At 1 in the afternoon, they turned the ship again and sailed northward around the first discovered point. It now clearly appeared to be a single detached rock beside a large promontory. A German sailor named Friesleben had been the first to spot the rock, and in his honor, Captain Cook named it Friesland's Head. This point lay below 58 degrees 55 minutes south latitude and 27 degrees west longitude. The promontory beside it was named Cape Bristol and appeared to be connected to Southern Thule, as they saw land far to the east that looked like a very spacious bay. Captain Cook did not dare waste time with a closer examination of this coastline, as he was constantly exposed to great danger here in westerly winds. He therefore decided to sail along the northern side of the island instead, which in any case would be the most important for seafarers. They kept a distance of 3 to 5 kilometers from shore in very light winds. The land was steep and inaccessible everywhere. The mountains were astonishingly high, their peaks constantly shrouded in clouds. The lower slopes were so heavily covered in snow that it was hardly possible to tell whether one was looking at ice or land, if not for a few slanted caves in the overhanging cliffs close to the sea, where the solid rock could be seen.
Wednesday, February 1st, 1775, Cape Montagu.
The next morning, they passed another prominent headland, which Captain Cook named Cape Montagu. Between this and Cape Bristol, there appeared to be a bay, and both promontories seemed to belong to the same landmass. Farther north, they discovered another point, which upon closer approach turned out to be a separate island. They named it Saunders Island. It was no lower than the mountainous southern coast and was likewise covered in ice and snow. The island lay below 57 degrees 48 minutes south latitude and 26 degrees 35 minutes west longitude. During the night, there was little wind. At daybreak, they steered eastward to sail around Saunders Island. On this course, they discovered two small islands to the north, which were named Candlemas Islands, after the day of their discovery.
In the 18th century, it was common practice to name newly discovered islands and geographic locations after the day of their discovery. This helped sailors keep a chronological record of their route and also reflected the connection between navigation, the calendar, and Christian feast days. On long voyages around the world, where each new landing was a significant event, feast day or calendar date often provided a natural choice for a name. James Cook and his companions, including Georg Forster, followed this tradition. For example, Easter Island was named after Easter Sunday, the day the Dutch seafarer Jacob Roggeveen discovered it in 1722. The New Year Island received their name because Cook sighted them on January 1st, 1775, the first day of the new year. Another example is Candlemas Island, discovered by Cook on February 2nd, 1775. This day marks the Feast of Candlemas, also known as the Presentation of the Lord in Christian tradition. It commemorates the presentation of the infant Jesus in the temple, 40 days after Christmas. The name Candlemas comes from the earlier custom of blessing all the candles for the year on that day. It marked the end of the Christmas season and, in agricultural calendar, was seen as the turning point of winter, a symbol of returning light and the hope of spring. Thus, many places discovered during Cook's voyages still bear traces of the calendar, linking the history of discovery with the timekeeping of those who found them.
Because of the adverse wind, they were unable to sail around the northern tip of Saunders Island and had to tack. This maneuver brought them so close to the shore that they discovered, on a low spit of land jutting far into the sea, large misshapen heaps of broken slate fragments. Behind these rose only jagged rock pinnacles and mountain ridges. The entire land had the most desolate and terrifying appearance imaginable. Not a trace of green was to be seen, not even the misshapen amphibians they had found on New Georgia. In short, they could not help but apply to this place the words of Pliny, Pars mundi, damnata arerum natura, et densa mersa caligine, a part of the world forsaken by nature and plunged into thick darkness.
Thursday, February 2nd, 1775, Southern Atlantic.
The following day, The wind allowed them to approach the Candlemas Islands more closely and determine their position precisely at 57 degrees 10 minutes south latitude and 27 degrees 6 minutes west longitude. Since there was no longer any sign of the southern land, whose northern tip they had circumnavigated, they turned eastward again. Captain Cook initially named it Snow Land, but later changed the name to Sandwich Land. Georg suspected that earlier seafarers might already have discovered this land and referred to it as the Golfo de San Sebastiano or Isla Cresalina. It was still uncertain whether the various prominent western points, Thule, Cape Bristol, and Cape Montague, belonged to a single land mass or were separate islands. Perhaps this question would remain unanswered for many centuries to come, since a voyage into this desolate region of the world was not only dangerous, but also of no use to humanity. The goal of this perilous journey had been to explore the southern hemisphere as far as the 60th degree south latitude, and to determine whether a large continent existed there in the temperate zone. The various courses they had sailed for this purpose clearly showed that no such landmass lay within the southern temperate zone. Since they had even advanced to the 71st degree south latitude within the polar circle, it was also highly probable that the area within the Antarctic Circle was not completely filled with land. The most respected naturalists of the century had believed that there must be solid land around the South Pole. This assumption had been greatly weakened by their experiences, though the scholars could not be blamed, as they had had very few facts at their disposal. Even without determining whether Sandwich Land was part of a larger continent, it could at least be concluded that one of the main reasons for assuming such a continent had been disproven by new observations. It had long been believed that the vast ice masses of the sea were formed on land by snow and fresh water. But it was now proven that seawater also freezes, and that this ice, apart from the layer touching the water, contains no salt particles, as these are expelled during the freezing process. Nevertheless, Captain Cook still believed that icebergs could only form along coasts, in valleys, and harbors of solid land. Only in this way did he find the different shapes of the ice masses explainable. Large, flat ice islands must have formed in harbors, while the sharp and jagged ones must have originated between rocks and in valleys from accumulated and frozen snow. Both types break off under their own weight from the massive body of ice and drift northward with the prevailing currents into milder latitudes. Captain Cook was therefore firmly convinced that there was a large piece of land around the South Pole, though he considered it of little value. He believed Sandwich Land to be one of the northernmost points of this continent, which he thought lay mostly within the Antarctic Circle. He also found it likely that this land extended farther north in the southern Atlantic and Indian Oceans than in the true South Pacific, because they had encountered the ice farther north in those regions. "Let us suppose," he said, "that no land exists. Then the cold around the pole should be the same everywhere up to the 71st or 60th degree of latitude, that is, as far as the known continents no longer influence the atmosphere. Therefore, the ice should not reach farther north in one place than in another. Yet the cold in the South Pacific is far less severe than in the southern Atlantic and Indian Oceans. In the Pacific, the thermometer did not fall to the freezing point until well beyond the 60th parallel south, whereas in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans it reached that point during the same season already at 54 degrees south.
James Cook's observation that the cold varied across different parts of the Southern Ocean can be scientifically explained today. The difference was not due to the distribution of land as he had assumed, but rather to the currents and winds surrounding Antarctica. The powerful circumpolar current carries water around the continent, mixing warm water from northern latitudes with icy water from the deep ocean. These currents determine where sea ice forms and where the ocean remains open. The South Pole itself lies on solid land, hidden beneath an ice sheet up to 4 kilometers thick. Surrounding it is floating sea ice, which covers a vast area in winter and almost completely melts away in summer. Today we know that the extent of the ice depends mainly on ocean currents, wind, and the seasons, not, as Cook believed, on the presence of land.
Captain Cook therefore abandoned further exploration of this coastline and set course eastward. His decision was mainly driven by the barren, desolate appearance of the land, the already shortening days, the approaching harsher weather in these latitudes, and the fact that a long journey still lay ahead before reaching the next place with fresh supplies, while their food stocks were already running low. They remained near the 58th parallel, where they frequently encountered snow showers and saw many ice islands each day. Here, contrary to earlier observations, the northern winds were colder than those from the south, strongly suggesting that no land existed in the southern direction. The sauerkraut, this excellent food against scurvy, of which they had taken 60 barrels from England, was now completely consumed. From the captain down to the simplest sailor, everyone regretted the lack of vegetables, which had helped to wash down the salted meat without making its rotten, half-decomposed taste too obvious. Now all longed for fresh and healthy food, and everyone complained that they were still lingering between the 58th and 57th parallels.
Wednesday, February 15th, 1775, Prime Meridian.
They turned northward after crossing the Greenwich Meridian. On February 17th at noon, they reached the latitude at which Monsieur Bouvet had reported his discovery, Cape Circumcision, and then sailed eastward along the same parallel, determined not to miss it. At that point, they were at 6 degrees 33 minutes east longitude. The weather was favorable, the wind steady, and visibility extended around 15 to 18 kilometers. On the morning of February 19th, they passed the position where Monsieur de Lozier Bouvet had recorded the promontory in his journal, but they found not the slightest sign of land and saw no more than 4 to 5 ice masses throughout the day. They continued on the same course until February 22nd, covering 6 degrees west and about 7 degrees east of Bouvet's supposed land. Captain Fourneau had also sailed across the entire area on his return voyage, where the maps indicated the Bay of San Sebastian. He had passed between their two discoveries, Georgia and Sandwich Land, and finally crossed the meridian of Cape Circumcision at 54 degrees south latitude without seeing any land. It was therefore highly likely that Monsieur Bouvet had seen nothing more than a large ice field covered with enormous floating masses, just as they themselves had observed such formations on December 14, 1772, after departing from the Cape of Good Hope. At that time, several officers had been firmly convinced they had seen land because the distant ice truly resembled it, and they were deceived in exactly the same way as the French captain. Captain Cook wanted to settle once and for all whether land existed in that region. On February 23rd, he sailed straight across the area without any hindrance, indeed, without seeing a single ice field, where 2 years and 2 months earlier the sea had been covered with immeasurable floating masses. Now that it was confirmed that no major land mass lay in this part of the ocean, they turned north to reach the Cape of Good Hope as quickly as possible. Strong northwesterly winds forced them far to the east until, on March 1st, they were finally able to set a direct course toward the Cape. During these winds, Captain Cook had already considered verifying the French discoveries made by Monsieur Kerguelen under the meridian of the island of Mauritius. But since their supplies were now critically low, and they could easily have fallen ill from hardships during the 2 months such a journey would have required, he decided it was best not to remain at sea any longer. The wind soon shifted again and continued blowing from the northwest. These frequent changes made the sailors restless and impatient, as their hopes for a better future were now at their highest. Never before had they studied the clouds so attentively, searching for signs of a favorable wind. The general unrest was almost beyond description. Their voyage had now lasted 27 months since their departure from the Cape, during which time they had not entered a single European port and had lived mostly on salted meat. Counting all the days spent on land, they amounted to no more than 180, barely half a year. This had been their only time for rest, and even then they had not always received fresh provisions, such as during their most recent discoveries in the Pacific. The stretch from New Zealand to the Cape of Good Hope was the longest and most arduous leg they had ever undertaken. The few refreshments they had received at Christmas Harbor and on the New Year Islands were barely enough to provide the entire crew with more than 4 or 5 fresh meals. Added to this was the lack of wholesome food, such as sauerkraut, and the increasing spoilage of the salted meat. As a result, the hardships of their unnatural way of life weighed more heavily on them now than ever before. Now that they were approaching a place connected to Europe, other thoughts began to trouble them. Those with parents or relatives feared that some may have died during their long absence. It was all too likely that this span of time had broken many cherished bonds, reduced the number of their friends, and robbed them of the comfort and joy of human companionship. Despite the shifting winds, the voyage proceeded so favorably that by March 15th they were already able to put aside their warm clothing, as they had reached between the 35th and 36th degrees south latitude.
Sailors! Disbanded sailors! Archangel!
The next morning, they sighted a ship to windward, and 3 hours later, a second one. Everyone strained their eyes to take in these welcome sights, a clear sign of how deeply they longed for encounters with Europeans, even if they had previously kept their hopes to themselves. Now, however, it was impossible to conceal their joy. Everyone broke out in the most intense wishes. They longed to hear just a single word from the strangers, or to step aboard the other ship. They hoisted the Dutch flag, whereupon the other ship showed the same. Then they raised the British flag and fired a shot to leeward as a salute of peace, but the other vessel continued flying the Dutch colors.
In the 18th century, encounters with foreign sailing ships were moments of danger. Since there were no radios, ships had to communicate using flags and cannon fire. When an unknown vessel appeared on the horizon, it was common to hoist a false or neutral flag first. This allowed one to observe how the other ship reacted, without revealing their own identity too soon. Only when it was certain that there was no threat did they raise their true national flag. That was the signal, "We come in peace." In friendly encounters, a salute was fired, a cannon shot without a ball, using only powder. It was a sign of respect. Depending on rank, several shots could be exchanged and the salute would be answered by the other ship. These signals were the only way to express friendship or hostility at sea, and often determined whether a meeting ended peacefully or fatally.
Now that they had entered familiar waters, where European ships were commonly encountered, Captain Cook ordered all officers and sailors to hand in their journals, which were collected and sealed. Those not directly attached to the Navy kept their records, but were asked not to publish the exact positions of discoveries before their arrival in England. The other ship was likely Dutch, returning from India, and was on the same course, though moving more slowly. On the morning of March 17th, they took soundings and found bottom at a depth of 100 meters, having reached the sandbank that extends around the southern tip of Africa. Fishing lines were immediately cast, and they caught a fish known as a pollock.
When sailors reached shallower waters, they cast their fishing lines because the depth is finally low enough for the bait to reach the seafloor. In the deep ocean, the line would be too short or pushed away by currents. Only on a sandbank like the one that stretched far around the Cape of Good Hope is the bottom close enough for fishing to be successful. The pollock they caught there was likely not a true Atlantic pollock, but a similar fish native to South African waters. The name was used by the sailors because it resembled the European cod, an elongated body, silvery gray color, and firm white flesh. For the crew, such a catch was a rare and welcome treat after weeks of shipboard provisions.
In the evening, they saw the coast of Africa, which here consisted of low sand hills, upon which they spotted several fires. The next morning, they lowered a boat and sent it toward the Dutch ship, which lay about 9 kilometers away. After a few hours, the men returned with joyful news. All of Europe was at peace. Yet this joy was overshadowed by the news of the fate of some friends aboard the Adventure. The Dutch captain had come from Bengal and had been at sea so long that he was unable to share any refreshments with them. In the afternoon, with fair weather and a fresh wind, they saw 2 Swedish, 1 Danish, and 1 English ship sail past under full sail and flying flags, one of the most beautiful sights they had seen in a long time. The next morning, the English ship drew closer, and Lieutenant Clerk, Georg's father, and a midshipman went aboard. In the afternoon, the wind freshened considerably. Their boat returned, and the other ship tacked, while they themselves continued sailing until they were close under land. This ship belonged to the British East India Company, was named True Britain, and its captain was Mr. Broadley. It was returning to Europe from China. The travelers could not praise Captain Broadley's hospitality highly enough. He had invited them to what he called a modest lunch. Readers can imagine with what hunger 3 starved circumnavigators, who hadn't eaten fresh meat in 6 weeks, fell upon a dish of fat Chinese quails and an excellent goose, which their host considered a poor offering. But when they told him how long they had been away from all European colonies, how long they had lived on salted meat, and how often they had considered seals, albatrosses, and penguins delicacies, the captain and his officers laid down their knives and could scarcely continue eating out of sympathy for their guests. At parting, Captain Broadley gifted them a fat pig and some geese, which provided them with plenty to eat over the next 2 days. On March 20th, they passed Cape Agulhas and were nearly blown past the Cape of Good Hope by a violent storm. If they had not, on the morning of March 21st, glimpsed land through the fog. Thereupon, they dared to set more sail than they had at any point during the entire voyage under similar wind conditions. On the morning of March 22nd, they dropped anchor in Table Bay. But on land, it was still the 21st, a quiet reminder that, in sailing eastward around the world, they had gained an entire day.
This brings us to the end of episode 66. You can continue listening right away as the voyage unfolds step by step. If you'd like to follow the route on a map or see how these places look today, you'll find links in the YouTube show notes leading to the website. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.